There was a Jewish sect in the first century that looked at the God of the Old Testament, the God who flooded the earth, who hardened Pharaoh's heart, who ordered the massacre of entire cities, who told Abraham to murder his own son, and they reached a conclusion so radical, so dangerous, that the early church spent 3 centuries trying to erase every trace of it. They concluded that this God was not the supreme being. He was not good. He was not even particularly powerful. He was, in their words, an ignorant, arrogant, lesser deity who had mistaken himself for the creator of everything and who was actively working against the spiritual liberation of humanity. They called him the Demiurge. They called him Yaldabaoth. They called him Samael, the blind god. And they believed that the real God, the true God, the God of light and spirit and infinite compassion, was hidden so far above this false creator that most human beings would live and die without ever suspecting he existed. This was not a fringe belief held by a handful of eccentrics in a desert cave. This was a sophisticated, intellectually formidable theological system with followers across the Roman Empire, from Alexandria to Rome to Antioch. It produced some of the most remarkable religious texts ever written, and it was so threatening to the institutions that would become mainstream Christianity and Rabbinical Judaism that it was not merely rejected, it was hunted, its books were burned, its teachers were branded heretics, and for nearly 2,000 years, almost everything we knew about it came from the writings of its enemies. Until December of 1945, when a farmer digging in the Egyptian desert near a town called Nag Hammadi broke open a sealed clay jar and changed the history of religion forever. Welcome to Sacred Mysteries, where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand why this first century Jewish sect believed the God of Genesis was a villain, you have to understand the world they were living in. And that world was strange, violent, and philosophically electric in ways that are almost impossible to imagine from the comfortable distance of 2,000 years. The first century of the Common Era was not a time of religious stability. It was a time of extraordinary religious ferment, a period in which old certainties were dissolving, empires were colliding, and the question of what God actually was and what God actually wanted from human beings was being debated with an intensity and a seriousness that has rarely been matched since. The Roman Empire had swallowed the Mediterranean world whole. Greek philosophy had spread everywhere along with Roman roads and Roman armies, and at the intersection of Jewish monotheism, Greek metaphysics, Persian dualism, and Egyptian mysticism, something new was being born, something that had no name yet, something that historians would later call Gnosticism. The word comes from the Greek gnosis, knowledge, not faith, not obedience, not ritual, knowledge. Direct, personal, transformative knowledge of the true nature of reality. The Gnostics, and we use that word carefully because it covers an enormous diversity of groups, and teachers believed that the fundamental problem of human existence was not sin, it was ignorance. Human beings were divine sparks of light, imprisoned in material bodies, in a material world created not by the highest God, but by a lesser, flawed, and in some versions, actively malevolent being. And the path to liberation was not following commandments or performing sacrifices. It was waking up, remembering who you really were, recognizing the prison for what it was. This idea did not appear from nowhere. It had deep roots in Plato, who in the Timaeus described the material world as the imperfect creation of a craftsman god called the Demiurge, who was working from a higher blueprint he could only imperfectly copy. It had roots in Persian Zoroastrianism, with its radical cosmic dualism, the universe is a battlefield between a god of light and a god of darkness. It had roots in Jewish apocalyptic literature, the Book of Enoch, the Dead Sea Scrolls, texts that described heavenly journeys, angelic hierarchies, and a cosmic drama playing out far above the heads of ordinary human beings. and it had roots in a very specific, very honest reading of the Hebrew Bible. Because here is something that mainstream religion has always struggled to answer cleanly. The God of the Old Testament does some things that are very difficult to reconcile with the idea of an all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful, supreme being. He creates a world and then decides to drown almost everything in it. He hardens Pharaoh's heart, deliberately preventing Pharaoh from letting the Israelites go, and then punishes Pharaoh for not letting them go. He orders the complete extermination of the Amalekites, including women, children, and infants. He tests Abraham by commanding him to sacrifice his son, then stops him at the last moment. But why the test? Why would an all-knowing God need to test anything? He appears to Moses in a burning bush, wrestles with Jacob as a stranger in the night, walks in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day. He gets angry. He regrets. He changes his mind. These are not the behaviors of an infinite, unchanging, perfectly good, supreme being. These are the behaviors of a very powerful but very limited entity. A being with emotions, a being with an agenda, a being with perhaps something to hide. The Gnostics looked at all of this and said, yes, exactly. That is precisely what we are telling you. The God of Genesis is exactly what he appears to be, a powerful, jealous, limited creator. And the clue is right there in Genesis chapter 3, in the words that God himself speaks after Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge. He says, and this is one of the most startling sentences in the entire Bible, he says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever, he drives them out. He drives them out not to punish them. He drives them out because he is afraid of what they are becoming." Think about that for a moment. The God of Genesis, in his own words, expresses fear that human beings might become too much like him. He acts not from love, not from justice, but from the instinct of a being who wants to remain on top. The Gnostics read this passage and said the truth is right there in the text, in his own mouth. This God is not your father, he is your jailer. And the serpent, the one who told Eve that eating from the tree would not bring death, but would bring knowledge, the serpent was not the villain. The serpent was the messenger of the true God, the one trying to wake you up. This interpretation, radical as it sounds, was not invented out of thin air. It was, in many ways, a careful and internally consistent reading of a text that has always contained more darkness and complexity than its later interpreters were comfortable acknowledging. And it generated an entire theology, an entire cosmology, an entire sacred literature. The Gnostic cosmology is one of the most elaborate and psychologically sophisticated religious systems ever developed. It begins not with the God of Genesis, but with something called the pleroma, a Greek word meaning fullness. The pleroma is the realm of the true God, the infinite, unknowable, utterly transcendent source of all being. This God does not create, he emanates. From him flow a series of divine beings called aeons, pairs of male and female spiritual powers, each one further from the source, each one a little less perfect, like ripples spreading out from a stone dropped in still water. The names vary by tradition. Sophia Wisdom is usually among the last and most important of these aeons, and it is Sophia who makes the mistake. Driven by a desire to know the infinite Father directly, without the proper mediation, she produces in some versions alone, without her partner a being, a flawed, imperfect, monstrous being, a being who does not know his own origin, a being who looks around at the emptiness and thinks, I am the only one, I am the greatest, I am God. This being is the demiurge. In the most influential Gnostic systems, he has a name, Yaldabaoth, sometimes Samael, sometimes Sackless the Fool. He creates the material universe. He creates the material world. He creates human bodies to trap the divine sparks of light that came from the pleroma and became mixed into matter through a series of cosmic catastrophes. And then, and this is the detail that is almost unbearably poignant, he creates Adam and Eve, and he breathes into them a spirit that he does not realize comes directly from Sophia, from the pleroma above him. He has accidentally given his prisoners the very key to their own liberation. The divine spark is inside every human being. That is the secret. That is the gnosis. You are not made of clay. You are made of light that has forgotten what it is. And the entire cosmos, the sun, the moon, the planets, the archons who govern each sphere of the heavens, is a vast, complex machine designed to keep you asleep, to keep you trapped, to keep you feeding the demiurge with your ignorance and your worship. Now, who were the actual people who believed this? This is where the history becomes as fascinating as the theology. The first and most important thing to understand is that Gnosticism was not a single religion. It was a family of related movements, sharing certain key ideas but varying enormously in their specifics. There were Jewish Gnostics, who worked entirely within the framework of Hebrew scripture. There were Christian Gnostics, who saw Jesus as the messenger sent from the true God to wake up the divine sparks trapped in human bodies, and who had very different ideas about what the crucifixion meant than what you will find in any mainstream church today. There were Gnostics, who drew on Egyptian religion, on Persian mysticism, on Greek philosophy, and they were everywhere. Alexandria in Egypt was perhaps the most important center, a city that in the 1st and 2nd centuries was arguably the intellectual capital of the world, a place where Greek philosophy, Jewish mysticism, Egyptian religion, and the new Christian movement were colliding and recombining in ways that produced ideas of astonishing originality and depth. The philosopher Plotinus, one of the greatest minds of the ancient world, was deeply engaged with Gnostic ideas. He wrote a sustained philosophical refutation of them, which tells us that he took them seriously enough to spend enormous intellectual energy opposing them. The early church father Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, produced a massive 5-volume work called Against Heresies, specifically to combat Gnostic teachings. The very existence of that work, its length, its detail, its urgency tells you something about how seriously the Gnostic threat was taken by the institutions that were beginning to consolidate what would become Orthodox Christianity. Among the most important Gnostic teachers was Valentinus, who lived in the 2nd century CE and taught in Rome. By some accounts, Valentinus came extremely close to being elected Bishop of Rome, which is to say, Pope. He was not a marginal figure. He was not a desert hermit with a handful of followers. He was a sophisticated, charismatic theologian operating at the highest levels of the early Christian community, teaching a system of extraordinary philosophical complexity and spiritual depth. His followers, the Valentinians, were one of the most widespread and enduring of all the Gnostic movements. Then there was Marcion of Sinope, who operated slightly earlier than Valentinus and whose ideas were, if anything, even more radical. Marcion took the Gnostic insight about the God of the Old Testament and pushed it to its logical extreme. He argued that the God of the Hebrew Bible and the God revealed by Jesus were simply not the same being. The God of the Old Testament was real, but he was the God of this world, a just but harsh deity obsessed with law and punishment. The God of Jesus was something else entirely, a previously unknown God of pure love and grace who had sent Jesus to reveal himself and to offer humanity an escape from the world of the demiurge. Marcion's solution was radical. He threw out the entire Old Testament. He kept only a version of the Gospel of Luke and 10 letters of Paul, and even those he edited, removing passages he believed had been corrupted by people trying to harmonize the new revelation with the old. Marcion was eventually excommunicated, but his influence was so enormous and his community so large and so well organized that many historians argue that the formation of the official Christian biblical canon, the decision about which books would be in the New Testament, was in significant part a reaction to Marcion. The church needed its own canon quickly, partly because Marcion had demonstrated how dangerous it was to let individuals make their own decisions about which texts were authoritative. Here is something almost nobody talks about. The Nag Hammadi Library, the collection of Gnostic texts discovered in Egypt in 1945, was buried sometime in the late 4th century CE. The timing is not accidental. In 367 CE, Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, wrote a famous Easter letter to the churches under his authority. In that letter, he listed for the first time the exact 27 books that would become the New Testament as we know it today. And he explicitly ordered that all other books he called apocryphal and heretical, were to be destroyed. Someone, almost certainly monks from the nearby Pachomian monastery, took a collection of their most treasured texts, sealed them in a clay jar, and buried them in the desert rather than burn them. They buried them to save them, and they stayed buried for 16 centuries. What came out of that jar in 1945 was nothing less than the library of the losing side of one of the most consequential theological battles in human history. Among the texts recovered were the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, with no narrative, no miracles, no crucifixion story, just wisdom sayings, many of which have no parallel in the canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Philip, which describes Mary Magdalene as Jesus' closest companion and implies a relationship between them that would make every mainstream church deeply uncomfortable. The Apocryphon of John, a full account of the Gnostic creation myth, told as a secret revelation given by the risen Jesus to his disciple John. The Gospel of Truth, almost certainly written by Valentinus himself, a meditation of extraordinary beauty on the human condition as a kind of nightmare from which we are slowly awakening. And the Gospel of Judas, not discovered at Nag Hammadi, but surfacing in the antiquities market in the 1970s. And finally published in 2006, which presents Judas not as a traitor, but as the only disciple who truly understood Jesus, the one Jesus personally asked to hand him over to the authorities so that his divine spirit could be liberated from his material body. Before we go further into what those texts contain, we need to talk about what happened to the people who read them, because the suppression of Gnosticism was not a clean administrative process. It was a war. And the weapons used in that war tell us something important about what was at stake. In the early centuries of the Common Era, before Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the various Gnostic movements operated in a world without a single dominant orthodoxy. There was no pope with the authority to define heresy and order executions. There were bishops, there were communities, there were fierce theological debates, but the boundaries were porous, the canon was not yet fixed, and the diversity of belief within what we loosely call early Christianity was staggering. A Christian in Alexandria in the year 150 CE might have been reading the Gospel of Thomas alongside the Gospel of Matthew and seen no contradiction. A Christian in Rome might have been following the teachings of Valentinus and considering himself entirely orthodox. That world ended with extraordinary speed once Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 4th century, and the state began to take an interest in which version of Christianity was the right one. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, called by Constantine himself, was not primarily about spirituality. It was about imperial unity. An empire with one God needed one definition of that God. The theological diversity that had characterized the first 3 centuries of Christian thought was not just inconvenient, it was politically dangerous. And from that moment forward, the tools available to suppress it were no longer just theological arguments. They were armies, laws, and fire. The burning of books, which we now recognize as one of the most reliable signs that a society is afraid of ideas, became systematic. Libraries that contained Gnostic texts were targeted. Teachers were exiled or executed. Communities were broken up. And the written record of what the Gnostics actually believed, in their own words, was almost entirely destroyed. Almost. Because someone buried a jar in the desert, and the desert kept its secret for 1600 years. These texts are not forgeries. They are not modern inventions. The Gospel of Thomas, in particular, contains sayings that many New Testament scholars believe are as old as, and in some cases possibly older than, the canonical Gospels. Scholars like Elaine Pagels at Princeton, Bart Ehrman at the University of North Carolina, and Karen King at Harvard have spent careers arguing that these texts represent genuine alternatives to what became mainstream Christianity, not corruptions of an original pure message, but different streams within a tradition that was far more diverse in its earliest centuries than most people today realize. What does that mean for the religion you grew up with or the religion you rejected? It means that the Christianity that exists today, the Islam that exists today, the Judaism that exists today, these are not the only possible outcomes of the theological possibilities contained in the ancient world. They are the survivors. They are the ones that won a series of brutal, high stakes competitions for authority, resources, and the right to define orthodoxy. The losers, the Gnostics, the Marcionites, the Valentinians, the dozens of other movements that flourished in the first 3 centuries of the Common Era were not simply mistaken. They were asking real questions. Hard questions. Questions that the winning traditions never entirely answered. They just stopped allowing the questions to be asked. And here is the twist that should make you stop whatever you are doing and think. The Gnostic critique of the God of the Old Testament did not disappear when the Gnostics were suppressed. It went underground. It resurfaced in the Cathars of medieval southern France, a Christian movement that also believed the material world was the creation of an evil God, and that the true God was a being of pure spirit who had nothing to do with the violence and injustice of the physical world. The Cathars were so threatening to the Catholic Church that Pope Innocent III launched a crusade against them in 1209, a crusade against fellow Christians fought on European soil. The city of Béziers was the first to fall. When the papal legate was asked how the soldiers should distinguish Cathars from good Catholics in the population, he reportedly said, "Kill them all. God will know his own." 20,000 people were massacred in a single day. The Gnostic question resurfaced again in the Kabbalah, the mystical tradition within Judaism, which developed its own version of the Gnostic cosmology with the concept of the klippot, the shells or husks, lower spiritual forces that obstruct the flow of divine light into the world. It resurfaced in the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza, who was excommunicated from his Jewish community in Amsterdam in 1656 for ideas that bore a striking resemblance to Gnostic pantheism. It resurfaced in the poetry of William Blake, who created an entire mythological system featuring a tyrannical creator god he called Urizen, a figure straight out of the Gnostic playbook. It resurfaced in the philosophy of Carl Jung, who wrote extensively about Gnostic thought and whose entire psychological framework, the idea that there is a deeper self buried beneath the ego, a true self that the ego suppresses and fears, is in its structure profoundly Gnostic, and it is resurfaces today. In every person who looks at the suffering of the world, at the cancer wards and the refugee camps and the children born into poverty they never chose, and asks the question that no comfortable theology has ever satisfactorily answered. If God is good and God is powerful and God made all of this, then why does it look like this? The Gnostics had an answer to that question. You may not like the answer. It may be wrong, but it was an answer. And it was an answer that took the evidence of human suffering seriously in a way that mainstream theology has often struggled to do. What do we do with all of this? That is the question. The Gnostics are gone, at least in any organized institutional sense. The Nag Hammadi texts have been translated and published and are available to anyone who wants to read them. And they are extraordinary, strange, and beautiful, and deeply human, full of images and ideas that feel surprisingly modern. The longing to wake up from a world that feels wrong. The sense that there is something more real behind the surface of things. The suspicion that the rules imposed on us by powerful institutions do not necessarily reflect the deepest truth about who we are. These are not ancient feelings. They are the feelings of millions of people alive right now. the Gnostic tradition asks us to sit with a question that is genuinely uncomfortable. What if the sacred story you were told, whatever that story was not the whole story? What if the text you were given was edited, selected, and shaped by people with specific interests in what you believed? What if the God you were told to obey was not the highest thing that exists? And what if the answer, the real answer, the one that liberates rather than enslaves, has been buried in a jar in the desert for 1600 years, waiting for someone to dig it up? The monks who buried those texts at Nag Hammadi did not do it because they thought they were preserving heresy. They did it because they thought they were preserving truth. Truth that someone very powerful wanted to destroy. Whether they were right is a question you will have to answer for yourself. But the question is worth asking. It has always been worth asking. And the fact that so much effort was spent silencing it should tell you something. Things that are simply wrong get ignored. Things that are dangerous get burned. So here is what I want you to sit with after this video ends. The Gnostics read the same texts you have access to. They looked at the same God, and they reached a conclusion that was so threatening that an empire mobilized against it. The question is not whether they were right. The question is, what were they seeing that made them so dangerous? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know what you think, because next time we are going to go even deeper into the hidden world of the first century. We are going to look at a figure who appears in the Gospel of John, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in traditions that predate both Christianity and Rabbinical Judaism, a figure who may have been the original template for the Gnostic idea of a divine messenger sent to wake up a sleeping world. His name has been spoken in secret for 2,000 years, and we are going to say it out loud. Stay curious. And remember, the most dangerous thing you can do in a world that wants you asleep is to ask with genuine seriousness whether the story you were told from birth is the only story there is. The Gnostics asked that question. They paid for it with everything they had, but they asked it anyway. And the jar they buried in the desert, the one that held their answer, survived every emperor, every bishop, every bonfire that came after them. That is not nothing. That is, in its own way, a kind of resurrection.